Good morning. So, we are starting a new unit today. Unit 11 is going to focus on the 1930s, which the major thing that occurs here is the Great Depression. We talked about the Great Depression, um, or at least leading up to the Great Depression, in the last lesson of Unit 10, and how the boom times of the 1920s quickly come to a crash. They definitely do not last forever, and therefore, we see a period of time where this image that you see in front of you is called the migrant mother. You see a lot of people in the United States struggling to survive as a result of the Great Depression. Um, this slide deck's a little different, so I'm going to kind of walk through what leads us up to the Great Depression here and talk about the causes. We'll talk about how the government responds as we get into lesson two. Lesson three will focus on um, moving into the later part of the 1930s. But lesson one right now is going to talk about the causes of the Great Depression. So remember, the 1920s, we see a huge post-war boom after World War I. The average income rises 43%. So that's almost half. So America, all of a sudden, people are making money. And what do you want to do when you make money? You want to spend money, right? So we have the highest standard of living. People are buying cars. People are buying things like refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, anything that they can purchase to make their lives easier. Factory production rises because people all of a sudden want to purchase things. So we got to make things so people can buy them. Business profits rise as well. The stock market is an all-time high. Americans had money to spend and they were ready to spend them. So as I already mentioned, cars, radios, refrigerators, anything that would make people's life a lot easier. Um, but by the end of the 1920s, warning signs were starting to set in. Unemployment and poverty were beginning to rise because you can only make so much to a point where then like things kind of fall apart. So farmers also in rural areas were losing their lands. There was an amount of overproduction, so people were not making money on farmlands. And then consumption begins to decrease. If people are losing their jobs, they're not purchasing things. And so, along with that, stock prices begin to drop. So at the end of the 1920s, we have Black Tuesday. This is not the cause of the Great Depression, but it was the huge spark that led onto it. So in October 1929, the 29th, we called Black Tuesday, the stock market drastically crashes. And in a minute, just like that, and this will be what your Ed puzzle is on, people will lose their entire life savings. People will jump out of windows because they have lost everything they had. So, what kind of led to this moment and what led to this idea of Black Tuesday? First was the Republican economic policies of the 1920s. All of the presidents of the 1920s were Republicans. They were also extremely pro business. They had this idea of a trickle down theory, the belief that policies that benefited big business and Americans' wealthiest citizens would eventually benefit all Americans. But it did not work. High tariff rates meant that nothing was coming into the country because tariffs are taxes that are paid on imported goods. So people from other countries would not trade their goods with us. So world trade drops. The debts of World War I are not being paid back. And then lastly, America's economy is directly affected by other nations and other nations' economic activity. So for the first time, like the worldwide economy is all kind of affecting each other. The second major thing is we have unchecked stock speculation. Speculation is where a person or an organization makes a risky investment in the hopes of making a quick, large profit. Speculators bought large amounts of stocks they thought would go up, waiting for the price of the stock to go up till they got to a higher point, and then would sell them off at a higher price, making a quick profit. Speculation at some level now today is illegal, but it was not in the 1920s. Secondly, people were buying on margin. So if you are an regular average American, you could buy a small percentage of a stock. So say you wanted to buy like 100 shares of a stock, but you only paid for 10, right? So it was almost like you were buying the rest on credit. So banks were loaning out money. And then as we get to the 1929, brokers begin to get nervous, investors have to pay up, stock prices begin to fall. Um, so, what then ultimately leads to the stock market and banking collapse. Noticing the downturn, other investors panic and also begin to sell, which leads to more panic. And then that leads to Black Tuesday. After Black Tuesday, we see a massive amount of banks collapse across the United States because of those speculation loans that they had given with people's money. So people like rushed to the banks to get all their money back, and the money was gone. So people were like, "Where's my money?" And the banks were like, "Oops, sorry," and just shuttered their doors. So this led to a huge banking crisis at the exact same time. And we'll talk about how, like, this cannot happen today because at the time the government had not put things in place to kind of stop something like this from happening. So imagine like you had gone to a bank and put $1,000 in the bank and said, "Here's the bank, my money is safe." It was not. It was gone. It was people's entire life savings were wiped out. Um, and this isn't so much for you all, but at least in my generation, like our grandparents were so shell shocked from this happening to them that they would like stash money under their mattresses for the rest of their lives, even though like this something like this would never happen again. So what that led to with the bank collapse is then more unemployment, more defaults on loans. So in 4 years or 3 years after 1929, a quarter of the nation's banks had closed. And we really didn't know how to react and how to respond to this. So, these pictures that you see here, this is what was called a run on a bank. So, people rushed to the bank to go get their deposits, and the banks were like, "Oops, sorry, we don't have any money." Like, there's not a little box that says, like, Johnny's money on it, and you can, like, go get your money back. Like, that's not really how banks operate, but people didn't really understand that. Um, so what would happen when these people would run on the bank is then the banks would just shutter their doors and close for good. So you see like several pictures here. If you've ever seen the movie It's a Wonderful Life, like there's a scene in that movie too where there's a run on the bank. Another cause was the massive overproduction of goods. So we had this new technology of the 1920s. We were producing things at an all time level. But then, things are overproduced. The market was filled with goods, and many Americans by this point couldn't buy them. Farmers had to take out loans to mechanize, to have machines themselves. They were hit especially hard, and there was really no world market for the goods that were produced. So you kind of just had, you know, this massive amount of product with very limited buyers. Something we discussed in one of the last lessons was the decline of the farming industry. The crops were abundant, but the amount of customers looking to pay their loans um, kind of shut down. If you can't pay your loan, even if with a house, or so if you're a farmer and you can't pay your loan, the bank forecloses on you and takes your land. So then no one can buy the lands. The banks are the ones that ultimately take the loss. So again, this leads to a severe decline in property values. The weather was also not favorable of farming at this time because the land had been so overproduced. The farms basically turn into dust. So, at the same time that all of these people are losing their property and losing their land, we have the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl happens significantly in the middle of the United States as well as the Southwest. You had massive amount of droughts, which is a lack of rain, bad farming techniques, which like kind of kick up these huge dust storms where you would have dust going, across the prairie land. So people fleed to California, face massive amounts of prejudice. So you kind of see here like families in Oklahoma would, pick up all that they had and move west. They just had to leave because these dust storms were what they were facing. Another cause was this huge unequal distribution of wealth. In 1929, 1% of Americans owns almost 60% of the wealth. Everyone else, 60%, so more than half of Americans, were below the poverty line. Remember, Herbert Hoover, when he was elected president in 1928, said that poverty would be eradicated during his presidency. It was the exact opposite. Corporations do not pass profits to their workers. Um, they begin to replace workers with machines, which is a lot of things that we talk about today, actually. So you have kind of the people up at the top that have all of the money, the middle class, and the poverty and poor. So, how does the world respond to all of this? In Germany, after World War One, um, the German Republic or the German Empire collapses. So they create the Weimar Republic, very weak and ineffective. Paper money quickly begins to lose its value. If you took World War One or world history, sorry, you used to be able to see people trying to purchase, a loaf of bread with a wheelbarrow full of paper money because it just had no value. American bankers had invested in Germany, hoping to end inflation. That didn't happen. So, what happens, and we'll talk about this in the next couple lessons, is because the government is so weak, it helps lead to the rise of radical groups, such as the Nazi Party, that will begin to seek power. In the United States, Herbert Hoover, who's elected president, will lose re-election to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, known as FDR. So he will pass what's called as the New Deal. We'll touch upon that in lesson 2. He tries to bring relief and recovery programs that create jobs, regulate the stock market that had crashed, and also the major thing too is he also has to save the banking system. In Great Britain, they had depended on foreign trade, so the depression hit them hard as well. The national government passes protective tariffs, increased taxes, and tries to regulate currency, but they, like the United States, are able to preserve democracy where that does not happen in a lot of other European countries. And we'll kind of discuss that as we lead to other lessons and how the world will respond to those. So there are questions and an Ed puzzle, and then please complete your mastery check.